Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Humanist Association of San Diego. Last week, we covered Islam. This week, we are going to cover an important topic. Today is Palm Sunday. It's leading up to Easter. And one of my favorite Easter jokes is, did you guys hear that they canceled Easter this year? They found the body. Exactly. So there's some things that I want to think about because these are important things. It's important to look at culture. It's important to look at religion. Religion encapsulates far more than belief. It encapsulates expectations, a sense of self, historical awareness. It orients your placement on the planet. So to understand someone's belief in religion is to have a better way to see how they see the world. And this doesn't mean that through understanding we endorse. Quite the opposite. In understanding, we become more attuned to communicate with them, to share with them, and hopefully they would share with us. And so today we're going to look at something that is taken for granted. Religion is a canon of commentary on the human experience, often with a divine flavor. But additionally, B, if something is purported as truth, we as free thinkers have an obligation to engage with it, should we so choose. And there's one thing that strikes me when I've looked at this, when I've studied this, and it's similar to the is versus ought distinction of David Hume. And it's this idea that truth and historical occurrence and meaning all have to intersect. This is quite a Western concept. If you look at the Abrahamic religions, for example, it matters if Jesus existed. It matters if Moses received the 10 Commandments. It matters if Abraham was influenced to nearly sacrifice his son, because these things come through a line of revelation and prophecy. And for a lot of people who are believers and acolytes in this, if it didn't happen, it means that it is devoid of value. There are things that didn't happen that are full of value. There are things that happen that might have trivial value. What you had for lunch 3 years ago on a Tuesday, it may have some value, but it might just be a little footnote. At the same time, there's poetry, there's art, there's speculation, there's metaphor. It may not be literal, it may not have happened, but that does not mean that it is without value. And this is important when we're talking about the Jesus myth. It's deeply important. If we look at Buddhism, for example, it doesn't matter if the Buddha was a real person. If we look at Taoism, it doesn't matter if the great master Lao Tzu was a real person. Sometimes truth and value overlap. Historical truth and moral value overlap. Other times they don't. And when we look at this, there's some incredible questions that emerge, valuable questions. And our speaker today is going to help shed some light on them. For example, if you look at the historicity of religion, and you look at the great flood that had supposedly wiped out the majority of humanity, a lot of people around the planet living in places like Damascus that have been around for 12,000 years didn't seem to get the message. Additionally, there's a lot of speculation, and duly so, that the Exodus did not occur. In fact, if you look at the historical record and the facts that have been laid out, and those who have investigated the archaeological evidence, the great Exodus probably didn't happen. And now we are on to the Jesus story. We are on to the Jesus story. And there is a fair amount of scholarship, it's the mythicist school, saying that Jesus Christ, Yeshua of Nazareth, was either an amalgamation of different historical figures or was completely fictional. David's book, Nail, does a really fantastic job covering this. Back then in Jerusalem, it was seen that it was more like, it's been said, it was more like the life of Brian, with messiahs running everywhere. And through political expediency, in the ways that religion developed, which religion did develop. And there's fantastic books on the development of religion, like one of the premier sociologists, Robert Bellah. I would say his masterwork, he came up with the concept of civil religion. Bellah's magnum opus and masterwork, Religion and Human Evolution, from the Paleolithic to the Axial Age, does a fantastic job covering that. Let's see, Edward Greenlee does a fantastic job looking at this from the 1920s. Thomas Paine from the 18th century does a fantastic job looking at this. And, you know, I think that our discussion today, our speaker today, is going to provide us with a fantastic grounding for some rather controversial and some rather important talk with our religious family members next week, should we choose to engage with them. And I want to make one final point before I welcome David in, because there's so much that I want to ask, so much I know that you want to ask. Like I said about truth, value, etc., there is a value in this. And the true value in whether this happened or not doesn't reach to the point of whether or not it happened. It's that those who assume that there was a supernatural element to this impose their expectations with a sense of entitlement on the politics of the day, usually at the expense of marginalized, vulnerable people. Before we started the chat, I brought up Greg Abbott and Texas with his weird fixation on trans kids. Additionally, we look at Florida with their recent bill about parenting and education, how parents should have more say over their children's education, and therefore we shouldn't allow teachers to bring up sensitive subjects to a particular point, which when people actually study this, look at it, they say, there's nothing wrong with being gay, there's nothing wrong with being trans. In fact, what you do is you send a message that there's license to abuse people. And additionally, we look at all of the anti-abortion laws that are in clear violation of Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where Texas established a system of bounty hunting. And now the House of Representatives in Oklahoma banned abortion outright. We study this so we can have a firm basis of understanding, not with the mere direction of trying to embarrass people, but to call other people to task to support people living today, to take other people into consideration, and to realize that we are all connected. And as I always say, it's helping other people, and we are humanists and we are here to help. And someone who's here to help us is a friend of mine, an author who's written well over a dozen books in different genres, fantasy to, I guess, commenting on religion, which many of us find to be fantasy. David Fitzgerald. He is an award-winning writer, historical researcher, and an atheist activist who lectures internationally at universities and secular events, and is a frequent guest on many podcasts. He is a book reviewer for the Journal of Higher Criticism and the star of a new monthly podcast of his own, The Myth of Jesus with David Fitzgerald, with co-host Daniel Sanderson, and author and founder CEO of the science and philosophy media outlet Planksip, Scott Heffler, PhD, a philosopher at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'll put some links in the chat. But David, you were here last with us back over 10 years ago. I'm glad that you're here. So quick question, I'll just open it up. Was Jesus a real person?
I kind of want to do a head count and say, how many think he was and how many think he wasn't? Fun fact about Jesus. 20 years ago, 22 years ago, it never even crossed my mind to think that there was not a Jesus. Of course it was Jesus. It had to be a Jesus. And it wasn't until I was curious about what we can, when you read the Gospels, one of the things you notice right off the bat is these aren't telling the same stories. They're all meant to be telling the same story, but in fact, the closer you look at them, the more you realize they are telling very different stories about who's supposed to be the same person. And so around 2000 or so, I got curious which of them is telling the truth, which of them is giving us the real Jesus, and which of them is giving us legendary creations that came later. And long story short, I don't think any of them are giving us the real story. I don't think the Jesus we have is an accumulation of, conflation of different figures. I think he's 100% made up. He's an allegory, and all of what we know about Jesus, when you look at what our bibliographical sources are for Jesus, they all boil down to the four Gospels, and our four Gospels boil down to our first Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, which appears to be allegorical right from the get-go. That said, I mean, there's nothing implausible about Christianity starting with a guy named Jesus. It certainly won't keep us from being atheists if there was a real guy named Jesus. It's just that the more we look at the evidence, the less it looks like what we have as the Gospels are based on anybody who actually existed in the first century. And when you were talking earlier, I was kind of biting my tongue because one of the side effects, I mean, I've been looking at the historicity question of Jesus for over 20 years now. And one of the most interesting side effects for me was how many ex-Muslims would come up to me and say, yeah, we're having the same debates in our circles about whether Muhammad existed. And Buddha's coming up and saying, yeah, we're having the same debate in our circles whether the Buddha existed. And, I could see the Buddha, but Muhammad, holy crap, how could that possibly be? And when they started talking about, yeah, this is why we're starting to have questions, all of a sudden, the picture of Muhammad starts looking a lot like the picture of Jesus, in that they both have very dodgy backstories. There's some serious problems with them. And the further you go back and the closer you look at them, the less they hold up to the official story. And I don't know how many of you happen to catch this, but earlier last year, I did a talk for the Global Center for Religious Research. And then I did another talk for the Recovering from Religion Foundation, talking about the evolutionary stages of world religions and looking at the founder figures of each religion, of like the top 10 or 12 religions. And, I knew this about Muhammad, I knew this about Buddha. Before I gave the talk, I wanted to give a quick run through and check all the founder figures of all the major world religions, and see if they had any kind of trace of the same pattern going on. Out of the top 12, every single one of them has a dodgy backstory. So much to the fact that I'm working on a writing project right now, a special report, if you will, for the Complete Heretic series, where I'm arguing that, yeah, religions seem to start and go through these different stages, no matter where you are on the planet and what period in history you're talking about. They all seem to go through the same 5 or 6 stages. And one of them seems to be, and then you get a religious founder figure who's completely mythical.
So I guess the first question, because we're asserting that Jesus didn't exist as a real person.
No. And to go back to your Moses question, yeah, Moses didn't exist either. And in fact, the majority of figures in the Bible did not exist. Not all of them. There's some things. King Josiah, King Hezekiah, guys we don't really think much about, but yeah, they didn't exist either.
Like in Age of Reason, I believe, Volume 2, Thomas Paine is writing about Moses, saying it's rather peculiar that Moses wrote about where he was buried.
Yes.
Additionally, if Moses said that Moses was the most modest of men,
These are all funny things.
not a
Yes.
modest, I mean, of course, these are
Yeah.
little quirky comments, but
Yeah.
since
Some in the chat room started to ask a question, something about, I didn't catch it. It just flashed on and I almost thought first.
do you apply the same formula to all historical people or just a religious figure? So this leads
Well,
to
that's a good, yeah, that's a good question too, because it's not just religious figures that fall into this sometimes. For instance, Pythagoras, Socrates, I tend to think he existed, but it's funny that everything we know about him comes second and third hand. Aesop, Homer, those characters are very, what they seem to be is they're like Solomon or Confucius. They become placeholders for all the wisdom stories or all fables or this and that piece of wisdom. And we even see Jesus that happening in the later Gospels and in early Christianity. Things get attributed to him because, oh, it's so wise, Solomon must have said it. It's so wise, Jesus must have said it. And we see this a lot. And there are some interesting historical figures that we generally have more than one line of evidence for. Any historical figure you want to ask, whether you were talking ancient, modern, all our acceptance of whether they were real or not depends on how much historical evidence is supporting them and how many kinds of historical evidence, for instance. I think in Nailed, I talked about people comparing like Julius Caesar or to Jesus or Alexander the Great. You see apologists bring up that kind of thing. And they try to say that, oh, if you ignore all the evidence for Jesus, you have to ignore all the evidence for anybody in history and nobody actually existed. And it's like, no, because let's look at that evidence. And of all the 5 or 6 major kinds of evidence you can have, physical evidence, personal writing, the blunt historical facts that this could only have happened if Hannibal, for instance, had really crossed the Alps, on elephants and gone into Rome. It wasn't just a result of people saying that he did something and believing that he did something. This has to have happened, Of all these kind of chains of evidence, that's what we provisionally put our belief in to whether these were historical events or historical persons. And so there's lots of people throughout history that don't quite add up historically. And it's interesting, the field of folklore research gets into traits of all these kind of mythological characters, and you start seeing the same kinds of things show up again and again. Whereas when you look for evidence for these things, you don't have any evidence at all, in many cases, in several cases. Or for instance, in Jesus, the one kind of evidence we have is this written accounts, but they're not by eyewitnesses. They're not contemporary. They're not objective, and they're trying to sell you a new religion. It's like by every standard, they're not the best kind of evidence, the worst kind of evidence you can have for anything, secular, non-secular, historical, mythological.
I mean, we have, honestly, even though this happened during our time, we have more evidence for the existence of James Bond than there is for Jesus Christ. Because Ian Fleming's cousin was a famous actor named Christopher Lee, who was a spy. So we have more evidence.
I've heard James Bond's also based on Roald Dahl, who was another real person. It's the kind of thing.
And also, do we have even more evidence for this the character at the point of "You're So Vain" from Carly Simon? So Ed has a question.
Yeah. I first of all, I'm going to talk from the standpoint of a devil's advocate, even though there is probably no devil. But first of all, let's say 60 years from now, meetup recordings have been destroyed. There are no computers. And people are trying to remember Jason 60 years from now. I would think that they're going to be differing memories of Jason. Some of them maybe even a little contradictory. But next also I'll say that, there were a lot of characters running around, preaching like Jesus, all these kind of characters, these My question is, why have all these different people of similar, ilk, why did he seem to survive and stand out? And then also another question is, Josephus, who's supposedly a semi-respected, legitimate historian, seems to, like I say, seems, quote unquote, to refer to a Jesus. And so these are some questions that kind of swirl around in my mind. Maybe you could address
These are all
them.
great questions, by the way, Ed. And there's three of them I want to answer. And so help me keep track of the ones. First of all, there's the question of, well, there was, it could be that it was just lost over time. The real Jesus was lost. And what happens is you get what's called the Chinese, what's the word? Telephone game analogy, where it's like, well, their stories started growing through time, and the real Jesus was sort of buried underneath all that. And again, there's nothing implausible about that. But when we look at our Jesus, the Jesus that we know of, the only evidence we have for him comes from, again, these four written sources, and all four of them are based off the oldest source, the Gospel of Mark, or as he called it, the author of the story of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And it seems to be everything that takes place in that. There's some huge historical problems. There's huge anachronisms, but everything that happens in there seems to be completely taken from Jewish scripture, to the point where even quotes that he's giving come from Jewish scripture. Even later on, in the end of the first century, church fathers like Clement, they're quoting what Jesus said, and their quotes aren't anything in the gospel. Their quotes are always something pulled out of the Old Testament. So that's a very problematic thing for saying that we've got a real Jesus in the beginning, because we don't seem to have like this oral tradition. Everything we have about him seems to be a literary construct. And I don't touch on that as much in Nailed, but in the follow-up to Nailed, Jesus, Mything, and Action, I go and break that down a lot further. So that's the first thing. The third was about Josephus. What was the second bit? What was the second question?
There was so many people running around.
Oh,
There were
yes.
so many preachers.
Yes. Yeah. Hey, well, here's the thing about that is one thing that we have in the first century is we have over a dozen loser messiahs, wannabe messiahs, who aren't anywhere near as interesting as our Jesus. And yet all of them did something that Jesus couldn't accomplish. They all made a dent in the historical record. And even figures like John the Baptist. Now, the evidence for John the Baptist isn't great. And so it wouldn't shock me if John the Baptist was also a made up cult figure. But in fact, it's slightly better than Jesus's. And we've got all these different, not just religious figures, but also political figures that were messiahs in the first century. But how come we don't have anything like that to corroborate the biblical story for Jesus? That's a real weird thing. In fact, that was one of the points I made in Nailed, is that either this guy taught these amazing things, if not did these amazing miracles, and yet no one outside his cult seemed to notice for the better part of a century, or he didn't do these amazing miracles and he didn't even teach anything revolutionary or new, and yet as soon as he's dead, we have all these weird feuding little house cults, not just in the Galilee, not just in Jerusalem, but scattered all over the Roman Empire, from Syria to Alexandria, Egypt, to the Greece, to Rome. And yet none of them seem to know anything about Jesus's life on earth, or agree about the particulars about who he hung out with and what he taught. And it's also very weird that for all of Christianity, we mostly rely on one guy, Paul, and half of what we have attributed to him is stuff written by other people in his name. So there's just a lot of weird problems with the historicity of Jesus, just from a textual standpoint, if nothing else. And you mentioned Josephus. I actually have a whole chapter in Nailed about Josephus, because there's two references that we know Josephus from. There's a thing called the Testimonium Flavinianum, and the so-called James reference, James, the brother of Jesus reference. I'll start with the second one first. The James reference in Josephus is claimed to be about Jesus, but if it is, it makes no sense at all if it's talking about anybody who was an early Christian leader or even the brother of Jesus. It makes perfect sense if the Jesus they're talking about is the Jesus who's actually mentioned in the story that Jesus mentions, Jesus, son of Damnius. Then all the problems with it make perfect sense, and there are no problems with it.
One question: who is Jesus,
sure.
son of Damnius?
So in the James reference, it's talking about this guy, James, brother of Jesus. He's actually Jacob, brother of Jesus. And there's been a margin note. We suspect there's been a margin note that says who was called the Christ. And we think that part there originally started as a margin note that was slipped into it because if it was supposed to be about James, the brother of the Lord, who was supposedly, he was a leader of the Jerusalem church and supposedly, a follower of Jesus. The story that Josephus is telling about this guy, he's talking about a political figure who was killed, and it would put all the Jews in uproar. Blah, blah. None of these things would make sense if this was a Christian leader he was talking about. But in fact, you just have to read the story to realize that he's talking about the brother of the high priest of the time. That's why they appealed to Rome. That's why the Jews were in an uproar, not because he was some hated cult leader of some faction that the Jews all hated. It's because he was a beloved figure who was attached to the high priest. And in fact, you just have to read it to see it's Jesus, son of Damnius.
So Rob has a question. Are you familiar?
I was going to say that's only half answered the Josephus question, but we can keep going if you want.
No, keep going.
Well, here's the other thing. So he's most famous for what's called the Testimonium Flavinianum, of this little paragraph in one of his books that talks about there was at this time a Messiah named Jesus, and he was wonderful, blah blah blah, and all those who he did miracles, and all those who followed him still follow him for the day, and now they're called Christians. There's so many problems with that there's no historian who doesn't think it's a legitimate passage. Now the fight has been, well, it must have been a partially authentic passage, and Christians must have just, mucked with it and changed it around. There's so many problems with that, for starters. First of all, the fact that somebody's tampered with the passage at all, that let's not put too much weight in it, for starters. But the other thing is, and there's so many, again, I've got a whole chapter on this, but one of the biggest things for me is that for 300 years, nobody seems to know about this passage. And from another 200 years after that, nobody knows about this passage except one guy named Eusebius, a bishop of Caesarea. And he discovers it, he mentions it, he's the only one to mention it for 500 years of Christianity, during a time when early Christian fathers loved reading Josephus, constantly cited him. And for instance, the church father Origen cites him and complains that, he really should mention Jesus when he talks about this thing happening to Jerusalem. And that same guy, Origen, who complains that Josephus never talks about Jesus, is the guy whose copy of Josephus's books came down to Eusebius. So Eusebius gets his book that has this very suspicious passage in it from a guy who complained that he could never find evidence that Josephus ever mentioned Jesus. So these are the kinds of things that make me say this is not even a partial. It's completely a forgery, an interpolation. And in fact, the only reason, honestly, that I can see why Christians even try to cling to these two is because if you take away those two, and we should, that means there's nothing outside the Bible for the entire first century that corroborates anything in the New Testament. And you have to go quite a bit further into the second century before you start getting non-Christian references to anything in the Bible.
Thank you. Rob, you have a question.
Okay. David, are you familiar with Steve Mason?
Yes.
Okay. I was listening to a video on and he was talking about the second passage that we're talking about.
Right.
Well, he agrees mostly with what you're saying, but the way he framed it was that the mention of, James got a brother named Jesus. Some people call him the Christ. He was explaining that that's kind of to him, the line points to there was an actual person named Jesus. And because it's such a throwaway line.
But here's the thing. We're not saying that line is a forgery. We're saying that line
Right.
is a liner note. And it's like,
Yeah,
the Jesus, because the Jesus they're talking about in that passage, it makes no sense if it's talking about our Jesus.
Okay.
Nothing in that story makes any sense at all.
All right,
if it's
thank you.
talking about-
May I ask another question?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. What do you think of Joseph Atwell and Roman Piso?
Short answer, I hate them. I think they're hacks. Absolute
Thank you.
hacks.
Wait, who?
I was
who
hoping
are
you would
these?
say that.
So Joseph Atwill is a guy who wrote a book called Caesar's Messiah. And there's others like Roman Piso and others who try to say that Christianity was a Roman invention. And sometimes they say that Flavius Josephus was the author of Christianity. Why they think this could possibly be true baffles me, because if you're smart enough to concoct all the crazy connections that they claim to find, you're smart enough to know that you have to ignore centuries and decades and generations of religious evolution. You have to just pretend it never existed or went away, or you just have to be unaware of it to make it work. It's, if anything, Christianity is older than it, not younger.
So looking at that, because as you mentioned, things change. I'm going to hold off this question. Do we have any other questions? Because I have a question that might take us down a really deep rabbit hole, but a really interesting rabbit hole with a lot of interesting rabbits. And maybe
I appreciate you being cautious about that, because that's one thing. Whenever I do a talk about this, rabbit holes pop up at every single point, and we could go on. I'm just trying to keep us focused on Jesus now and not all the other religions as well. You know?
Yeah. All right, Ed.
Yeah, I have a couple of things here. I think the question that still wasn't answered for me, why one preacher, one of these crazy preachers, remains for, following generations, the other didn't. But I would suggest that Jesus had a really good PR campaign. He had 12 people, 12-man PR staff that could teach a lot of PR people today how to put across some stuff.
Let me jump in right there before you go too much further with that. Because one thing that's interesting about his posse of 12 guys is no Christian document agrees on who these guys were, which is why when you look at listings of the apostles, you say, oh, and there's this guy who was also called this, who was also called that. They have to, they like, for instance, Matthew Levi, there's no character named Matthew Levi. There's Matthew, the tax collector, and there's Levi, the tax collector, who's become one and the same character. So even his circle of friends is very much in doubt as well.
Yeah, and going back, 60 years from now, and there are no computer records available, and people would say, now, who is this Jason guy? And they would have differing memories. And then who are these guys that used to hang around with Jason? There was this humanist group, etc.
Well, let me stop you again. Because again, we do have evidence of Jesus type figures in the first century. A lot of them, several of them, that we know by name. And yet, in those same records, we don't have anything from Jesus. And Jesus in the Gospels is so much bigger than anything that these guys in real life did. And yet again, we do have evidence of these guys. Why don't we have evidence of Jesus? It's a real question.
Good question.
Even when you read Paul's writings, Paul, by all accounts, was probably a real person. There's some people who doubt that he was, but I think he was a real person. But even if you just take what he says at face value, he doesn't seem to know anything about what Jesus did on earth. Everything about his Jesus is someone speaking to him through the Old Testament scriptures or through visions directly to his ear. We don't even get the story of him on the road to Damascus getting zapped by that light and having the risen Jesus appear to him. He loves talking about his own credentials and his miracles and whatnot. He never tells us anything remotely like that story that Luke gives us 3 times.
Yeah, that's
Hold on 1 second. All right, Madeline and then Rob.
And then it sounds like we have to go back to Ed because I don't think he was finished.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to inject something because with apologies for being a troublemaker, but and with
No.
apologies for being relatively ignorant in this corral of history loving gentlemen and ladies. I just want to know where, if anywhere, are the women in this lineage, because I have an interest and a vested interest in my 50% of the population or less.
Sure.
And what I notice everywhere all the time is the discussion of who gets to write, whose authority or authorship gets pushed into the future, and it just is never women.
And it's
And
even
so-
worse than that, because there are mentions of early female apostles, and when I say apostles, I'm talking about followers of Jesus, not the 12 friends and family of Jesus.
Right.
But the way Paul used the phrase, and other writers his generation, they were early Christian leaders and prophets and such. And we do have mention of them. For instance, a lot of the house churches, several of the house churches that Christians met at were headed up by females, by women owners. And another interesting thing is the early Christianity is so freaking misogynist and sexist that they would even take the names of female characters and turn them into male characters, quite deliberately, just to avoid that feminine trace. And we have later gospels that were written, like the gospel according to Mary Magdalene, where you fill in this gap. In fact, a lot of the Gnostic gospels tended to do that. They would give the feminine side of the story. And yet we don't have any reason to believe those are telling us a real story any more than any of the other ones do as well. They all seem to be drawing on the same literary sources and putting their own spin on things.
Right. The authors
and like so many of the 12 apostles have these symbolic meanings. Same thing with the women. The fact that there's 3 Marys at the crucifixion of Christ, that struck early fathers like Origen as being very symbolic and mystical.
So essentially, Jesus had binders of Gnostic women.
Well, Gnostic is a loaded word because binders of Gnostic women. Love that. There's some really amazing gospels out there that came a little further down, where there's some very interesting dynamics going on between Jesus and female followers, and some with Jesus and male followers as well, actually. I'm working on a book right now, or 2 books, but Sex and Violence in the Bible. I'll be talking about some of those later gospels that preachers don't seem to like to talk about too much anymore.
Yeah. Well, my point, and then I'll mute myself, is that we're characters in other people's books, but we're not the authors, and therefore can never be the authority, never be the historians, never even be more than servant scribes. We never get to sign the document.
Yeah. I could not agree with you more. And I think your points are very well taken, Madeline. And again, this isn't something that accidentally happened. This is something that church priests, monks, scribes, the religious authorities did on purpose to put men in charge. And even in the writings of Paul, Paul never says anything as misogynistic as what we read in the letters to Timothy and Titus, where it says women should be silent and I don't permit them to be an authority among you. Paul never said that. Paul had his own issues with women. We don't need to get into that right here and now because that's another rabbit hole. But yeah, it's obvious that the early church had a very serious problem with women being anything except supporting figures in a story about men. Craig's saying something. Women weren't even. What was the rest of that?
Women weren't even acknowledged in the U.S. Constitution.
Wow. Well, there you go. There you go.
And
Yeah.
by the way, if you want a great look at a woman's voice in terms of scriptural review, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had sort of an anthology of different perspectives called the Woman's Bible. It came out, I believe, in 1897. You can find it for free. So Rob, and then back to Ed.
Oh wait, before we jump on that, because Madeline, you made such a good point, and one other thought occurred to me. First of all, I'm losing it. Hang on. The first thing I was going to say is that it clearly bothered later Christians too much that they would like write the gospel according to Mary Magdalene, and invariably they'd cast her as like the number one disciple of Jesus, if not his girlfriend and such. But what was the other thing that was even more? Damn it! This is the problem with the rabbit holes, is I lose my great trains of thought. Let's see if it comes back to me. And apologies, Madeline. Wait a second. Give me a second. Let me think. It wasn't just that the Gnostic Gospels are. Oh, yes, here it is. This is an interesting thing that may or may not be true, but I think you'll find it fascinating nonetheless. The author of Luke and Acts is the same person. And there is an argument that can be made that whoever this person was not a guy, but was in fact a woman, which if true means that a quarter of the New Testament was written by a woman. I don't know if that's true or not, but the arguments for it are very interesting because whoever this person was, they were very much interested in big tent Christianity, and they wanted to include everyone's perspective. And they were especially interested in seeing things from the woman's point of view. So like, for instance, angels appear to Joseph in Matthew's gospel. In Luke's gospel, they appear to the women. And it's the women who have smart things to say and wise things to say. Anyway, so just for that. Yeah, thank you for bearing with my brain meltdown. Who's next?
Thank you so much, Rob, and then we go back to Ed.
Thank you. I have a kind of a little bit different, because he brought up Paul, and Paul was supposedly searching out and persecuting Christians, right? But he's not really specific about that. And we know from Josephus that there were many messiahs. So I'm wondering, was he just anybody that was a supposed messiah, therefore a Christian? Would he be persecuting them, or just followers of the way?
That's a really good question, because Paul himself says that you've got people, I'm a follower of Apollo, I'm a follower of Paul, I'm a follower of Jesus, as if these are all different factions of a wider group. And he's also talking about his rival apostles who preach another gospel and another Jesus. So I would love to hop in a time machine and see how variegated early first century Christianity was, because it seems like the further we go back, the less organized and homogenous it is, and the more it's just willy-nilly. I think it's a great question.
Thank you.
Ed.
Yeah, a couple of things. You made some really good points about Paul. He's really intriguing. And even among Christians, Paul is controversial. Yeah. And some people would claim, that some say he's the real Christian, or he's not, he's a bogus Christian, or, but I think maybe Paul rescued Jesus from obscurity. He maybe saved Jesus to make it a religion.
But if he did, it's weird that he ignores everything that Jesus did and acts as though you only could discover Jesus if you A, studied the scriptures really well, or B, heard him talking to you. Because one of the things, like for instance, apostles and disciples, Paul never uses the term disciples ever in any context for anybody. But he talks about who an apostle is. And for Paul and his generation, an apostle was a distinct person that, there's a hierarchy from things like exorcists and healers and deacons and whatnots. And up the top are apostles who get it straight from Jesus's mouth. But disciples of Jesus, family of Jesus, those aren't even on the list. They don't even warrant it. And again, what he says is an apostle is anybody who could say that the risen Jesus had appeared to them.
We'll get to you in a minute, Robert. But as far as Paul, it's almost as if he invented his own religion, so to speak.
Well, I think in a lot of ways he did, but he wasn't the first Christian. And as we've already intimated, there was more than one kind of Christianity around. If you read the book of Hebrews, I think that probably gives the best idea of what kind of things Paul and his fellow apostles, like Apollos and all the others mentioned in passing, were preaching. They were preaching this celestial Messiah who was never on earth, who did all this stuff in the sanctuary in heaven. And because he did, we didn't have to worry about the temple being destroyed, or, even if you're talking about the Gospels, or that you didn't have to worry about that going forward, because the kingdom of God would be coming soon.
And you could say maybe partly why Paul was elevated and linked to Jesus is maybe the councils, of the early Christian churches. They kind of determined what is legitimate in terms of literature and what isn't. So maybe they just kind of lumped things together and created this kind of link,
And I think you're right, because it would have to be, because otherwise it's the fact that we only have one guy for the entire first century of Christianity, for the most part, giving his thoughts on it. It's like, we don't have anything that's really from Peter or James or any of the Jerusalem church leaders, let alone the 12 disciples who were probably fictitious from the get-go. But it's weird that we don't even have like church records. We just have this bogus history in Acts that's made up from other sources and is clearly not a real thing. And even the things that, if there is any truth in Acts, like some of the trial transcripts, for instance, of some of the early Christians, if there's any truth to be found in them, they're saying things like, these guys did these miracles and everyone went up in arms about it, and no one could believe it, even though Jesus is supposed to have done much bigger miracles and just came back from the dead and is in fact still in the Lamb. And the Romans who are supposedly, had their whole empire shooken up because of him coming back from the dead, don't even seem to know who he is. It's some weird thing of Jewish theology to them. So yeah, it's very weird.
One last thing here, the Jesus Seminar, you read their version of the Bible, and whatever Jesus said is in red quotations. Yeah. And I'm just wondering how you think you can actually defend what they came up with as being Jesus or not.
Well, they actually had, and they did it by vote, but they had red, they had pink, they had gray, they had black for, he definitely said this. He certainly didn't say this. He may have said this. He probably didn't say this. And if I was on there voting, I'd be in all black, because everything that Jesus said, we can say, there it is from Psalms. Here it is from Isaiah. Here it is from Zechariah. There's nothing that he says, and there's nothing that he does that doesn't have some kind of scriptural reference to it to Hebrew scriptures. And Mark does this without telling us that's what he's doing. Matthew goes out of his way saying, and this was done to fulfill this scripture and this prophecy, even from things that aren't prophecies and things that aren't even scripture, things that there's never been found. But he seems to think it was all foretold in the prophecies, which is another interesting thing.
Go ahead, Rob.
Another thing I find interesting about Paul is that he concentrated almost entirely on Christ.
Yeah.
And at that time, the word Messiah had a mythological meaning to it rather than the actual meaning of, like with Saul and David and Solomon, they were anointed by God. By this time, it got elevated to that mythological thing.
Well, it was definitely in the process of that, I think. Yeah.
You know, as opposed to, say, the Ebionites who just, you know, Jesus is a prophet, but hey, he's a human.
Right. And what's interesting about that too is that meanwhile, John the Baptist, he had his own cult going on, and there were Baptists who were saying, oh no, John's the Messiah. Clearly he's the Messiah because of this reason. And we even have second century texts that like quote the debates. They're written from a Christian standpoint, so they're probably made up, but they're showing the followers of John the Baptist debating the followers of Jesus as if they're rival messiahs.
Didn't some of them think that, oh wait, that's Elijah reincarnated?
Right.
So
which is one of those things. This is one of those things that make me, if I had to bet on whether John the Baptist was real or not, I would say, yeah, he probably was, because they go out of their way to stick him in every single gospel. And in fact, Robert Price had an interesting theory, not a theory, but a wonderment, if you will, saying, well, we know the gospels are all mythological and we know they're all allegorical. Is Jesus an allegory for John the Baptist? And that's why he shows up in all the gospels. And
in a magazine called History Today, they had a very interesting article on John the Baptist, where again they would argue that he was a real person, and then they would again, you know, I fortunately I don't have the magazine anymore, but the way they argued it out made complete sense.
Yeah, and
I agree with you. He's probably more historical than Jesus. Maybe
not a total lock, because he's also portrayed as a second Isaiah, a second, as you say, Elijah. But it's interesting, the followers of John the Baptist, the Mandean sect, that has survived all the way up until, it may be extinct now, but as of like the 1980s, they were still living in parts of Iraq. There were John the Baptist's followers. Who knows if they're still alive now? But I mean, the fact they've been around a long time as well. Another interesting fact about John the Baptist, when you look at Luke's gospel, the first 2 chapters of Luke's gospel have nothing to do with Jesus. They're all about John the Baptist, and they're clearly taken from a Baptist scripture of John the Baptist, because everything that it's been inserted about Jesus in there can be taken out completely, and it makes better sense. In fact, one of the giveaways that they're not really talking about Jesus and Mary is that the Song of Mary, the Magnificat, if you've heard of that, is a song that Mary sings in that portion of the gospel, but it's taken from Samuel. And in both Samuel and the early part of John the Baptist, the story of John the Baptist, you have an older mother who thinks she's too old to have children, and God blesses her with a son, and that's what the song's about. So really, that should be the song of Martha, John the Baptist's mother, not Mary. And so just another hint that the funny thing is also in Luke, John the Baptist story is longer than Jesus's nativity story by a margin. So, I mean, it's very clear, and that's just one hint, that John the Baptist cult and Jesus' cult were originally not the same thing, and until they finally became domesticated and put into the fold. And it's not a coincidence it was somebody like Luke who was trying to bring the Pharisees in, the Gentiles in, all the Christians in, all different types of Christians in.
Where elsewhere I was reading that they're talking about, you know, like say, where did Jesus get all of his disciples from? They were built in.
Yeah.
Because if he's a disciple of John the Baptist, you already have a group of people. He's charismatic. He's going to have his little tribe there.
Yeah.
So when John the Baptist went out, he already had a built-in group.
Yeah.
So
and it's funny, in all 4 gospels, you have 4 different reasons and connections for, oh, they are strangers, they don't know each other. Oh, they are second cousins, first cousins. It's like they can't keep their story straight. Same with Joseph of Arimathea. They can't keep their story straight on who Joseph of Arimathea is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And there's lots of characters like that. throughout the Gospels. And it's funny, because we don't speak Aramaic or Greek, the allegorical nature, this is kind of not as obvious to us, but it's like place names and character names in the Gospels are incredibly apt, as if, like Jairus, whose daughter gets woken up, means he will arise, or she will arise, something like that. Zacchaeus, a temple leader, means leader of the people. It's like these names are really spot on the nose. And the places where they happen are as well. Like Arimathea, no one's ever found Arimathea. We don't think Arimathea existed. And it just happens to mean place of the best discipleville, Judea. And that's where Joseph comes from.
Was it like a donut shop, like Arimathea, we have the best.
I said again, people that study legends and mythology and stuff, that's one of the indicators of how it's mythology, is because when the name means X, Y, and Z stuff, type of stuff.
Yeah, and you see that happening throughout the Gospels. Yeah.
There's a few things that I want to bring up, a few things that I'd like to bring up. Because like I said, we discussed Islam last week, and even though Islam came later, so many parallels. For example, the questioning of whether or not Muhammad existed. But with the epistles and the synoptic gospels, we have the sunnah and the surah. We have the hadiths, which are sayings of Jesus, which are the sayings of Muhammad, which are similar to the epistles. And we have the sunnah, which are the surahs, which are the verses in the Quran, which are similar to the synoptic gospels. And it's interesting that, Muhammad didn't write it. One of his followers wrote it, Abu Bakr. And then there was
not only that, but some of it seems to predate Muhammad. Yes. Some of it seems to come from Syrian liturgical writings.
Yes. Because Muhammad's first wife, Khadijah, her cousin was a Syriac Christian, and that's how it all came.
That's how it happened. Just amazing coinkydink again. Yes.
And we like to think that we advance, and we like to think that things change, and we like to say, well, that's how things are done back then. But the more that we study history, the more we realize that they're just as full of shit as we are. They were just as confused as we are. They were just prone to passions and schisms as much as we are. And we find ourselves connected. And it's so valuable, because what you learn is that we're all trying to discover how the world works. We're all trying to make our way. And if we look at it, for example, the pedigree of the Abrahamic God, there were lots of little gods that were all over the place, peripatetic civilizations that you had city-states with a ziggurat with one particular god you would pay homage. And then we see different cultures coming together. We see the way that the text changed, and even from the Old Testament, we see two Genesis stories of coming together with many of gods and one God with different characteristics. We also see the fact that if we look this up in the pedigree of how this emerged, that El, the god figure, the god of the hill, had a wife, the Asherah. And in the earlier text, had a son and a daughter. The son was Baal, B-A-A-L. And, that later got pushed to the side. And then we see as political power, as religious authority expand. We see the nature of things growing. To
Jason, I hope you can see that I'm biting my tongue at everything you're saying.
I'm feeding you with this because I want to hear what you have to say about this. And it gets to the point that we have Ray Kroc saying that he wants McDonald's franchise golden arches to be as ubiquitous as churches. So, looking at this, with the thesis that Jesus was purely a mythological figure, and as you're saying, and this is why I'm saying this is going to be a longer question, because I want an exploration of this, and Rob and Ed and Patricia and Mala and Madeline, and everyone's going to have questions. So, for the first century, not much at all. And then later, you have different images of Jesus from different racial backgrounds. And Jesus was to fill a particular need. And, from early on, it was, this is our Messiah. people disagreed with us because we said that he had a heavenly father that was born on earth, which of course that narrative had to be there to make it resonate with the people, where Zeus or Jupiter would turn himself into a swan, walk by a woman, she'd be pregnant. And I made a joke recently that there's so many parallels today where Zeus wanted to have sex with a young boy and paid off his father with Olympic stallions, and they would Catholic priests today. You know, the stallion can buy plenty of horses with that. So,
and when you hear early Christians talking about this kind of stuff, they don't say what pastors now say, oh no, that's just later stuff. Christians never use that. They say, oh no, David, this is just like what you heathens say, because Satan saw this ahead of time and created all these counterfeit Christianities.
So,
you know,
I'm building you up because I want to see you go with this. So we go from obscurity, lots of different things, trying to like cobble things together to resonate, to have an image, to the 4th century Council of Nicaea, going further in the 14th century, where the King of England stands in front of Avignon, being excommunicated, to later schisms, to the 16th century, Luther and Calvin and Geneva, to also, I posted a link in the chat about your book on the Mormons, to the 19th century with the Millerites, Jehovah's Witnesses, et cetera, different punctuated moments of Christianity.
It's so ironic that Christians
how do we get from obscurity to Amway?
As Darwin would say, I mean, it's ironic that Christians don't believe in evolution, because Christianity is a Darwinian jungle. It is a mofo of evolutionary processes from start to finish. Textbook examples of evolution. It's all evolution, baby. Yeah. And what's the amazing thing is, wherever we think we go back to one point and say, oh, and this is where this started in Christianity. Oh, wait, nope, sorry. It goes back further to here. And it's like, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, paganism, you know, it's just, it never stops. And that said, you're going to love the next book I'm coming in, and I cannot wait for you guys to read it, because it's all about the things we're talking about, how these stages of religious evolution give rise to this kind of religion, that kind of religion, that kind of religion, and how one of those stages seems to be, and then we make up a founder figure, and boom, and we're off and running. Yep. That's my TED Talk, everyone. Good night.
Because how much I could expound on this easily. I want to hear you
right
this, but
right.
How much did, like, for example, we see the 2 Genesis myths together, where you had carrying gods, carrying demiurges that created a group of people in our image, in our own likeness, and then you had one particular God figure that had a lot of histrionics that created one man and a companion, and compiling them together, it was, and I have to say this, my boyfriend has a small grapefruit tree outside of his apartment. For the last several months, because it wasn't fertilized or watered particularly well, but it was watered well enough to survive, this grapefruit was germinating. This fruit was germinating. It was about like 3.5 feet off the ground, smaller tree. It was germinating, and it finally turned yellow, almost yellow. And the other day, when I was coming back with the dogs, it was gone. So for the first time in my life, I understood how God feels. But regardless. So how how did the character of Jesus change, and how much did it resonate with the times that Jesus was living in? And one last thought. Yeah. I had this idea, right? And steal it if you want. I'm probably never going to get around to it, to write it as an essay. But it's this idea of, had Jesus lived? And people are like, Islam is so violent. And it's like, Jesus didn't have enough time to get started. The 5 minutes that you see him, he goes into the temple shop and he has his gang beat everyone up and starts scolding everyone. And then he's put down. But if Jesus had lived and had time to build up a military presence, could we even see Islam, for example? But
the funny thing about Islam is the reason that Islam seems to be so scary right out of the box is because Islam started from the Arabic conquests. It was not the inspiration for the Arabic conquests. The Arabic conquests were the inspiration for the creation of Islam. That's where that is about.
So what, okay, to get back to the question, what are the most important points since the first century to the development of the Jesus mythos, as we see like here and there? What were the most important points, if someone wants to look more into this to see the conspicuous nature of how this was thrown together? What are the like 5 most important moments in Christianity?
Well, it's interesting to recognize first off the bat that when you're talking about early Christian writings, for the first 150 to 200 years, we have nothing at all whatsoever. When we first start to get scraps of fragments of Christian scriptures, it's like P52. It comes from either 125 to as late as 175, and so Christians that given that range, they always say, "Oh, it's from 125, if not earlier." No. That's the earliest possible range it could be, and it turns out that that's even too low. That the actual papyrologists say, "Oh no, it's probably very late 2nd century, early 3rd century," which means, among other things, that our earliest Christian writing from the Gospels is from a gospel that's not in our Gospels. It's an extra canonical gospel that we don't know anything about. So we know by the 2nd century, there were lots of gospels floating around and lots being created, along with Acts, along with epistles, you name it. We just see in our Bibles the tip of the iceberg in there. But again, for the first 150, 200 years, we have nothing, 0. And then we have tiny fragments. And then towards the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd, we have complete books of the New Testament. And it's not until the 4th century that we actually have complete New Testaments. And of those 2 complete New Testaments, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, they each have books that the other doesn't have. And they have books that we don't have. We have books they don't have. It's like, it's trying to pin down where we get this things concretized and canonized just keeps getting younger and younger and younger. You could say the same thing about the Old Testament. The Jewish scriptures, everything before Josiah and the Babylonian conquest and Hezekiah, everything before the Persian period seems to be completely made up, completely mythological.
So one point of interjection on this about the mythological side.
Yeah.
It also seems, outside of Paul, it seems as though there were other, much like I mentioned about, I hadn't gone fully into it, but for example, when we see the Jews getting involved with the Persians, we see Zoroastrianism giving a denigrated god in terms of a lesser god that had a negative aspect attached.
Right.
Like Ahura Mazda and Agne Manu became God and Satan. The Book of Job not even being part of the original.
I don't think people realize how much indebted Judaism is to Persia and Zoroastrianism, and by extension Christianity, because ideas like heaven and hell, a good God and a bad God,
and then later,
paradise,
and then later with Augustine, for example, the big injection of Aristotle.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and Philo of Judea, Philo of Alexandria, rather, he was one who came up with the idea of the Holy Spirit. That comes straight out of Philo. I saw a question flash on about what about people like church fathers like Origen and somebody else. And you got to realize, when I'm talking about early Christianity, I'm talking like very 1st century, possibly 1st century BC. By the time you get into where we actually have Christian writings from church fathers, we're already 100 years into the game or so. And again, I'm not sure if I made the point, but what we have as far as Christian scriptures go, we don't know how much they match the originals, what Paul really said. In fact, we know for a fact half of the letters attributed to Paul are not written by Paul, and everything that Paul's has written in his name seems to be mashups of more than one letter in many cases. And it's been redacted, re-edited, interpolated. And we probably will never find all the interpolations.
So this also goes along with my line of questioning about the adjustments to Christianity over time. If we look, we can see mega church pastors that are brimming with pop psychology, trying to obtain another Gulfstream jet, and like
Yes.
Joel Osteen. Which, by the way, last night at Coffee and Conversation, Chad, who just came in, we actually just one quick anecdote, because I think this is fantastic, and we could probably go down this route too for another question. But we had an individual who emigrated from Russia a few months ago. And we were talking about the Orthodox Church there and evangelicals. And I asked a question about, I'm going to screw up the pronunciation, their glossolalia, the speaking in tongues.
Glossolalia, yeah,
And
exactly.
And you know, there are some Christians that abide by the idea of the Pentecost and speaking in tongues. And I said, did you hear any of this? Because I would be fascinated to hear what glossolalia would sound like from a Russian speaker,
Yes,
an American. And then Chad, and I'm not going to play this because of fair use, but Justin Roiland, the co-writer and main voice actor for Rick and Morty, did his Rick Sanchez voice, called him the Joel Osteen prayer line, and is like, what, pralines? And what is that? Is that baby talk? What are you talking about? Anyway, so looking at that, Joel Osteen has a God that hellfire doesn't seem to be much of a thing. The Mormons have different.
he's always a little short on cash too, for some reason.
And the Mormons, or as they prefer to be called now, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Latter-day Saints, which, by the way, the quote-unquote pilgrims called themselves the Saints. The Massachusetts Congregationalists called themselves Saints as well. Just take that as you will. But looking at the Congregationalist Saints in Massachusetts versus the Latter-day Saints and Joel Osteen's Happy Fun Time Hour, what we notice is there are different expectations of Christianity, where in some, even Jehovah's Witnesses, you don't celebrate birthdays. It's more austere, the mortification of the flesh coming from Paul in a Calvinistic stance, and others where Jesus is love and acceptance and drawing us together. So looking at that, because Jesus, as we know, said, or ascribed to this character Jesus, I did not come to bring peace but a sword. I came to set everyone against everyone, etc., etc. Paul later, cut your arm off if it offends the sin construct. So when did Jesus become about love in all of this versus something more austere?
See, this is the thing, and it's not just about Christianity now. This goes back to all religions, is right out of the box. You've got the love verses and you've got the smite you verses. And depending on when they were written, you can tell how much they felt like the church felt like they could be a part of the society around them, or how much they felt they could not be a part of the society around them. Because when you have a group and the other is somebody you can do business with, suddenly your God loves them too and can be made to love them too. When you can't, nope, they must be smitten. It's smite time. Smite makes right.
I just came up with an idea that would be fantastic on this. What we need a biblical magic 8-ball. like Lord, what should I do in this occurrence? It's like Ephesians 17:12 or something like that. Like turn the other cheek, or
there was an Onion article. It says, you've had a disaster. What happens? People survive. God is merciful, quote New Testament. Everyone dies. God is wrathful, quote Old Testament.
Or better yet, the Onion article, like God answers prayers of paralyzed little boy. No. So, all right. Other questions? I'm hogging David's time, and I want to put this out. Darlene, Esther, Chad. I know Chad's being uncharacteristically quiet. Chad, Putting Chad on the spot.
Oh no.
Chad's
Well,
fantastic.
but while you guys are thinking about your questions, let me just put in a quick plug, because the book I'm writing right now, and I don't even have a title for it, I'm just calling it Special Report at this moment, but it's going to be talking about everything we've been talking about today as far as the evolution of religions and the founder figures of religions. And the book I've been working on for quite some time. If you haven't seen my YouTube talk, Sexy Violence, Violent Sex, the Weird Ass Morality of the Bible, that is what I'm trying to turn into a book right now. Much deeper dive into the Old Testament than I ever did before, but with some really juicy stuff about sex and Jesus as well. So keep watch for those this year. I do have a personal page, a website rather, and I have a Patreon page now, and I'm trying to post more stuff on the Patreon page for patrons. And that is a huge help for me as well. So when I'm not doing the running around trying to make a living, trying to feed these cats and dogs and wives, I'm working on writing as much as I can. Still no questions?
Go
This
ahead.
is kind of a sidebar.
Yeah.
Western and central New York is the Palestine of North America, because
The burnt over district.
yeah, the burned over district, Seventh-day Adventists and Mormons and all these weird sects. I thought that's fascinating. Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah. It's so bizarre that out of that one single time and place, we got so many bizarre ass religions coming up. I don't know if you've read my book, The Mormons, but I talk about that. And on Myth Vision podcast, we did a whole series called The Secret History of Mormonism. I did with Bryce Blankenagel from Naked Mormonism. And I swear, HBO, if they want their next Game of Thrones, they should really do a deep dive into early Mormonism, because it's got all the sex and violence you would want in a show, and you could all film it out here in America. It is fascinating to see what an amazing, it's not just bullshit, it's amazing bullshit. And the bullshit that went into making that bullshit is just,
season 4 is in the Mexican exile.
Well, I'll give you we thought we could do like 8 or 10 episodes of this series. When we finally wrapped up, we were like episode 29, 30, and they had just gotten to Utah. That's how much we got into this series, the early history of Mormonism. Yeah.
Can a religion survive if its founder doesn't die early on in the story?
Hey, that's actually a serious question, and not just the founder, but persecution in general.
Yeah.
There's been studies of religion that show that religions that don't get at least a little persecution in the beginning, they don't get galvanized, and they don't get that, it's something about, the hammering of that builds up their cohesiveness and bonds them together in a way that otherwise they just become a social society and they kind of flitter away. But when people have to give up things and double down and ignore failed prophecies and just continue to build their faith, that has some more staying power that the other organizations don't. It's perverse and bizarre, but it's well documented.
So I have a question for someone else really quick. So Mickey, we know that you attended Azusa Pacific. You're a humanist, you're an atheist now. So coming from that particular standpoint, from a well-established, well-known Bible school, essentially, what are some of the arguments that you would have encountered in your experience at Azusa Pacific that would have refuted what David had said?
Refuted.
Yeah, what are some of the substantiating aspects of why Jesus was a real person?
Well, I think part of it is that it didn't matter. That might be a great deal of it, is that it didn't matter if he's a real person or not. It's a matter of faith. There was a substantial group of people there who respected science and historic, evidence. We were kind of the minority, but we were the ones we were in the theological department. So it was kind of our purview. That most of the school was music and evangelism. So they didn't care about this stuff.
Interesting.
And frankly, I don't think they wanted to deal with it.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, the church and being in the church was their bread and butter, especially the professors. So there was it was only the people in the theoretical or the more specialized schools that were going after this kind of thing.
Interesting.
It's kind of where I established my permissions to be gay. So I got what I wanted out of it, being a theological student.
Yeah.
And I didn't become an atheist until, a couple decades later.
Yeah.
I hung on to my faith, but I knew that the historicity of Jesus was dubious even then.
Mm. That's fascinating to me too. I always love hearing people's deconversion stories, what it was that made them finally say, yeah, no. And it's funny to me that being gay came first and then giving up Christianity came later, and they weren't connected. That's fascinating to me too.
I just couldn't
Well,
see
I
that.
mean, I had heard so many conversion stories from the pulpit about from evangelists who they had been alcoholic or whatever, and then they converted, and then God used them. I thought, well, I'm going through what I'm going through. I can't stop it. I knew that I didn't have any control over whether I wanted to love men or not.
Yeah.
That wasn't a choice for me. So
Right.
I just pushed forward. My faith wasn't much of a choice either, and I continued with it. And it wasn't until that I got into 12-step programs that I was kind of disabused of my allegiance to the Lord.
Yeah.
And it was stepped down into generic God. And then that was when that happened, I was like, oh, I better start listening to some atheists. And I did. And I was impressed with their courage at, allowing themselves to say, I don't know, when confronted with questions of why are we here?
Yeah.
So, I was fascinated with atheists in my early recovery. This was around 2002. And I did a conscious deconversion of myself and just adopted atheism as my default on purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you give yourself permission to be this or think this on purpose, it's a whole different thing than being dragged into it unwittingly, I guess. It's when you actually say, yes, this is what I think, this is what I do, this is who I am. Yeah.
Well, and it was also giving myself permission to follow what I thought I was seeing. I for a long time, listening to atheists, listening to even politicians was verboten in our church, and we would just say, "Oh, these guys are of the world,"
Right.
and so we don't put much stock in what they say.
Right. That sounds very familiar to me too.
So I took I just took the blinders off and looked around, and what I saw was a bunch of very frightened apologists,
right,
scrambling constantly to put things together to
right,
preserve their system.
Yeah, I don't know how many the rest of you felt that way, but when you lost your religion, didn't it seem obvious in hindsight? At least I know it did for me.
Well, yes, obvious, but it took more than just being obvious. It took courage to accept the obvious.
Yeah,
because
I'm not saying that to downplay anybody's struggle with that for sure by any means.
No. Well, what the apologists were doing was telling us all those years, ignore the obvious.
Yeah.
And so to accept the obvious was the change.
Yeah.
It wasn't that I didn't know about the world. It's that I just had somehow sequestered myself from it, from believing that what I saw, it's kind of the old thing of faith is believing what you know ain't so.
Yes. Yeah. I think we've got another.
I love that because that's what it is.
I was just scanning the crawl, and it sounded like somebody had a question as well. Somebody else.
Alan.
Was there anybody else, Jason?
Madeline has a question. Well, I wanted to share anecdotally that when I was a child, my family was hyper religious in a very sort of proactive, practical way, like be kind, practice this, pay attention to yourself, master yourself. It was part of Catholicism, and I enjoyed the ritual. And my mother was a Sunday school teacher. She taught a very beautiful lesson, none of which I remembered. And she asked me, she asked everybody, what did everybody learn? And I was a very small child because we were still in Alaska. And I raised my hand. I was so enthusiastic. I said, when the curtains get wet, they stick to the window. and my mother recognized right away I was going to be unique. And so I noticed everything all the time. And it was a mindset that made me a universalist. So I dabbled in everything. Yeah. And then when it was safe and I had permission to start asking questions, the Humanist organization appeared in my life and made it very safe. And
sorry, we're getting some of the crosstalk from some of their lines.
Sorry. And as soon as there was safety in asking questions, I got to be my natural self, which is a curious child, a curious elephant,
Yay.
Yeah.
I love that.
So when we have a planning meeting every Tuesday night, and several of us work diligently to come up with our curriculum and the calendar. And one question that was brought up on Tuesday night, and I think that this plays into one last question before we wrap up and do final thoughts. It's, do we have an inherent desire, naturally, a need to feel that we have a savior? Because we have something called hyper intentional.
1.25 miles, turn right.
Oh, there you go. That's the savior telling me to turn right. See, look what happened. I tried to get on truth and it's telling me to turn to the right.
Sorry. The old early GPS.
Oh, no.
Okay. So anyway, So we have this idea, this is where religion comes from. It's been thought and pondered that the idea of religion comes from the same reason that your dog will start barking at a bag that's floating in the wind, that we assume that there's an agent behind something.
Right.
And religion is said to have emerged when we had a specialization of careers where we would have an interlocutor on this side and there'd be a spiritual agent on the other side that was in connection or caused the natural forces. And it emerged from there. But one thing coming from the West, from our culture, it's more than just Christianity, it's Islam, it's a very Western thing. From after when gods went from amoral to immoral or moral, an idea of an external agent who will save us. So do we have an inherent need for a savior? We, for example, see as Martin Scorsese calls them, theme park ride movies, Marvel, DC, about these supernatural characters that will save us from ourselves and save humanity. Do we have an inherent need for a savior?
I think what we have is we've got a psychology that there's a lot of things in that question, and there's more than one answer. But I mean, we have a need for a father figure. We have a need for a mother figure, and that's why even though the Catholic Church has tried to get rid of the goddess figure for so long, she keeps popping up, and we have all these saints, and Mary, the Virgin. And we want to be children. Children is our safest time, is when we're getting taken care of for most of us. So I think there is a temptation to get into that mindset of where the sky daddy and the earth mother will take care of us just fine, and it seems natural to me. I hesitate to make too much of a generalization about religion, because the more I study religion, the more I realize there's so many things going on in every single human mind on the planet and throughout human history that got a different religion for everyone, no matter what they call themselves, no matter how faithful they are to a particular scripture or writing, holy writings. The interpretation of that goes on in everyone's mind, and they're all slightly different, unique, like snowflakes, in a good way. And bad ways too, I suppose.
So this is our last chance for thoughts and questions before we wrap up. We're going to, of course, have our social time afterwards.
Sure.
All the good questions come up after I stop recording. But
I was going to say, if anyone thinks 20 minutes from now, oh, I should ask this, you can. Oh, I'm always happy to get emails from everybody. It's everybodylovesdave@gmail.com, or you can find me really easily on Facebook, or again at davefitzgerald.org.
all right, so we're going to go around really quick. I'm going to point this out to people who usually talk, maybe a little quieter today. Darlene, any final thoughts or questions?
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
I came so late. I would feel rude having any sort of question when I joined so late.
We'll get you next time.
It's fine. And David hopefully will come back talking about his upcoming book. But I'm glad that you're here. And we have a phone number. I won't say it because, it's going to be on YouTube probably soon. But we have a phone number. And if somebody who's on their phone, I don't know the area code, but if that person wants to say anything, might even be Chad. I know Chad came in for a moment. Esther? All right. Craig, Mala, or Jeremy? Oh, Chad's connecting to audio. So, Chad.
Chad's been connecting for a while. I'll just say thanks for coming, David, and enjoyed listening. You cover most of my questions.
Oh, super. I'm glad. Thanks, Chad.
All right. David, I feel fortunate that you were here. And I think if any of us are going to have a fun time, if we wind up attending a COVID-safe Easter party for some ham and hiding eggs.
Just like Jesus did.
I just want to say thank you. This has been a religious experience for me.
By that, Ed sacrificed a virgin.
One of 77 virgins.
I recuse myself.
I know that he is an unpopular figure because he did some rather inappropriate things, but
yes, Hitler was bad, Jason. He was bad.
But I was going to say, on his recent comedy CD that I think, comedy album that won a Grammy, Louis C.K. talked about that virgin aspect, and he asked that question. And of course, he's a really screwed up, mentally ill man, and he brings up provocative things that are incredibly funny that can only come from a really screwed up, insecure, mentally ill place.
I have to agree with you on both those things. I saw him do a thing on the Catholic priest scandal, and it was hilarious. It was just brutal and hilarious.
Was it the video about the purity bricks?
I'm trying to remember. He was interviewing some Catholic priest and talking about and you think it's legit and you think it's fine, and then the Catholic priest starts saying like, oh no, it's all about screwing little boys. Everything else is just icing on the cake.
But what about God?
Yeah, exactly. It was
the priests, after they rape young boys, which, by the way,
that was
a lot of young women who are molested and raped by priests as well. And
but
that essence is taken into the priest, and they excrete a white brick.
That's right.
Down
That's
Bibles.
That was it.
And then there was like an Air Force commando back area, like Sector 9er. We have a molested priest in area too. But anyway,
it was just so it went to 11 so quickly on that. It was just hilarious.
And so he asked this question. He's just like, so with the Muslims, with the 72 virgins, where do they come from? Does God just kill a young person just to have a virgin, or are they just raised like farm-raised salmon?
Well, the real question is, who wants a virgin? You want experienced sluts with lots of life experience and things to say and intelligence in their heads. I don't see the appeal for virgins.
You want someone who has the know-how to put fingers in certain places,
right?
Imagine.
Yeah. Oh, we've gone down quite the rabbit hole. Yes.
We love this talk. We love this talk.
You have a question.
Go ahead, Darlene.
Oh, it's not a question. I forget what number of virgins it is, but I was watching this thing about talking about the language of it, and the Muslims get angry though, so but anyhow, they were saying that it might actually be misinterpreted, and it might mean as like that large number, like 24 or 72, instead of virgins, it could mean grapes, like different varieties of grapes,
white raisins or something like that.
Oh, you already know this.
Yeah. But it's still weird that the number 72 is that's a weird number for it to be. But yes, isn't that bizarre? And it's like it's so weird that there's a question like, this is your scripture, don't you know what it's supposed to say or not? It's like, well, could be this, could be that. We don't know.
Yeah. I can also do a plug for art. Like, their art was, excelling really, really well when a lot of reason was going on in the pagan Greek and Roman religion. And then there were so many ice ages, but then the art content kind of went down, and gods in the paintings always, or saints or anything, they always had to be in this form, is ecstasy, they couldn't really be having real experiences, and So like philosophy and art and music, they actually do a service for people. They do a form of functioning in society of the job of liberating the onlookers or the hearers, and the freeing and the liberation of people. And so, yeah, I'm just doing a plug for art. So
Yeah, it's funny because I was just reading something about, they were talking about dance in early religion, and how just the fact of like dancing in a rhythmic, nothing fancy, but just a rhythmic portion is sending jolts from the feet to the brain, through your whole body, and you do this enough time, and it creates these ecstatic states. And music, same thing. Like the big, those giant medieval cathedrals with those huge organs. They don't just play the music, but they also play these substrata of very low frequency noise that you feel in your bones, and so it's hitting you on multiple levels.
Come down to St. Mark's this Sunday. We have the biggest organ.
Nice.
Really quick, but about art, Darlene, you just reminded me of Renaissance art, where you went from beautiful Greek sculptures, etc. And the thing about Renaissance art, they couldn't exactly master the cute baby.
Oh wow, yes.
There's a whole thing about ugly babies in Renaissance art.
There are some scary baby Jesuses. Yeah. Some of you have to wonder if, like, is that the patron's kid they're painting? The local bishops, or yeah.
That's what you get
That's
from
a
virgin
scary
birth.
There's a scary looking Jesus right there. Look at that.
Don't comment on this Christ hairstyle, or Will Smith will get up and smack. All right, everyone. I think we're going to wrap up. Everyone give David a warm San Diego thank you. Even if you're not in San Diego. Social time. David, thank you for being here. Get David's books, and David will be back hopefully when we see his next book. Thank you, David.
Yeah. Thank you.